Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you. My name is Brad Thompson, and I am the former Executive Director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. For those of you who have not heard, the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism no longer exists. We have now received a transformational gift of $25 million from David and Lynette Snow, which means the Clemson Institute will now and forever be known as the Snow Institute for the Study of Capitalism. As many of you know, the Snow Institute is also the home of the Lyceum program, which is now recognized as one of America's most prestigious academic programs. And the Lyceum program uses a great books approach to studying the history of liberty, capitalism, the American founding, and the principles of moral character. Now, it is my great pleasure today to introduce my old and dear friend, Professor Brendan McConville of Boston University. As you will no doubt detect the moment he opens his mouth, he is a native of the great state of New Jersey. Professor McConville received his BA at Reed College in Oregon. Professor McConville and I were comrades in arms as graduate students at Brown University, where we did our Ph.Ds many, many years ago under the supervision of the great historian Gordon Tess Wood. At Brown, Mr. McConville and I wreaked havoc on and caused great emotional distress to the faculty and other graduate students. Professor McConville is a professor of history, as I've said, at Boston University, and he is the director of the David Center for the American Revolution at the American Philosophical Society. He is also a fellow of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts and the Massachusetts Historical Society. Professor McConville is the author of several excellent books, including The Brethren, A Story of Faith and Conspiracy in Revolutionary America, The King's Three Faces, The Rise and Fall of Royal America. And finally, These Daring Disturbers of the Public Peace, The Struggle for Property and Power in Early New Jersey. Lastly, he is the co-creator and co-host with Professor Jay Sammons, whom many of you know, for a radio program that they host in Boston called The Historians. Now, let me end this introduction by sharing with you an amusing story about Professor McConville that I have wanted to say publicly for the last 30 years. At the end of our first year in graduate school, the Brown history faculty ranked the first-year graduate students. 2 students were identified in the department meeting as the top 2 students of the program, at which point one professor stood up in protest and is alleged to have said, "How can we rank these 2 as our best students? One is a right-wing nut, and the other is just a nut." Ladies and gentlemen, I will let you determine who was the right-wing nut and who was just the nut. Please join me in giving a rousing Clemson welcome to my old friend, Professor Brendan McConville.
Well, I suppose I should say thank you, Professor Thompson, for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here at Clemson. It's my first visit here. It's absolutely a spectacular campus and really impressive. And I've heard nothing but great things about the Lyceum program, about the Clemson Institute, now the Snow Institute. And I would simply add, the Snow family is to be saluted for supporting this kind of scholarship and intellectual activity. There really is a transformative, it's a fabulous gift. And I hope it will, and I have very little doubt and a strong confidence it will be used to further the aims of the Institute in the best way. And it really is a spectacular testament to not only to Professor Thompson's leadership, but to every person in this room who upholds those things and studies and things and engages in the life of the mind here at Clemson. I also do, I think I've heard that story, but not from Professor Thompson about our graduate days, but it is true. Also note that we played a lot of ping pong and I regularly defeated him, which is, I would say one of the highlights of graduate school for me. In any event, I do want to thank you for having me. It is a great pleasure to be here. The title of my talk today is Franklin, British subject, American constitutionalist. In the aftermath of the Stamp Act crisis of 1765, which begins the revolutionary crisis in America, the British Parliament investigated British Americans' violent response to the legislation, to the Stamp Act. By English standards, the Stamp Act was mild, and the members of Parliament assumed that the unrest must have some other origins. They sought their answer to the troubling question of why the colonists were so defiant in the response to the taxation. They were trying to look back in the years before 1765 to look for an answer. In their case, they picked as shrewd and cunning an informant as one could possibly imagine. Benjamin Franklin, scientist, diplomat, writer, Franklin of Philadelphia, as he referred to himself with a kind of studied restraint at the opening of his interview. In the years before 1776, before John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, before Washington took command of the Continental Army, and before Hamilton wrote the Constitution, Madison wrote the Constitution, and Hamilton established the financial system, Benjamin Franklin was the most famous colonial American in the world, and indeed, to many people, he was colonial America. For several hours, the members of Parliament questioned Franklin about the British provinces on what they saw as the edge of the world. He assured Parliament that Americans, and I quote, had not only a respect, but an affection for Great Britain, for its laws, its customs, and its manners. It was a true evaluation of the situation, and it was considered a command performance by the members of Parliament, that this person could stand up and talk for hours about the situation there. Today, I want to examine Franklin's life and constitutional thought. I want to argue that Franklin was not truly of the Revolution as we think of him, but was really of the First British Empire. Franklin loved the empire. He became famous in the empire. He wanted to preserve it, and he almost did. And I want to argue that his career as a constitutional writer, which has been largely ignored by scholars, is far more important than commonly thought. Franklin was the most active, the most long-running and dynamic constitutionalist or lawgiver in the Revolution, though ultimately the least successful. His efforts let us reconsider revolutionary constitutionalism in a manner that problematizes our contemporary understanding of constitutional thought in the Revolutionary period. Franklin was born in Boston in 1706. He was the 15th child of a family that ultimately had 17 children, which was not uncommon in the colonial period, and the 10th boy. Franklin's father was a candle maker and a staunch Puritan. He sent Benjamin Franklin to the Boston Latin School, which still exists. It's the Boston High School Honors Public School. He only attended school, Franklin, for 1 year. That's the only formal education he ever received. 1 year at Boston Latin. There's a joke in Boston that still runs. That's all you need. All you need is a year at Boston Latin, and then you're ready to go. Franklin was apprenticed to his brother James at the age of 12. His brother James was a Boston printer who founded the first independent newspaper in Boston, free of government control. To be apprenticed to a printer was seen as a good opportunity. It was an artisanal job, but it was a high-status artisanal job because you had to be literate to be a printer. Franklin, of course, was no ordinary apprentice. He began to read widely, even though at age 12, and soon established a reputation as a thinker and writer. He wrote in that time the famous silent, do-good essays, while under his brother's nominal control. He wrote under this assumed name because he didn't want to embarrass his brother with his political and social views. He also became, under his own tutelage, a kind of Christian heretic, a believer in one supreme being, but doubtful at times about other aspects of Christianity, including Christ's divinity and the existence of the Trinity. He would again become a kind of Christian at the end of his life, although albeit an unorthodox one. He also became, at the age of 14, a self-taught vegetarian. Before that was sort of hip, before that was popular. And he would continue on and off throughout his life to be a vegetarian, which is a strange thing. It really is odd. The ambitious Franklin and his brother quarreled constantly, and that led him to run away towards Philadelphia at age 17, in 1723. He was already, as a teenager, ambitious for fame and to be recognized for his genius. Franklin, in those long years when he runs away, to the time of the Revolution, was an ambitious British subject, only too happy to be in the British Empire. And he was the only one of the founders to achieve that goal of fame in the empire. By the time the Revolution comes, nobody knows who any of the other leaders in America are. Franklin is the only one that has a kind of international reputation. The years following his flight to Philadelphia saw Franklin's remarkable rise, which was propelled really by his remarkable abilities and equally astonishing talent at cultivating the patronage of wealthy and powerful people. He had one final characteristic which really helps this. Franklin was lucky throughout his entire life, and luck played a big role, but an important role. He had the ability to exploit those lucky moments in a kind of way that propelled him higher and higher in the imperial social order. Powerful people recognized his talents and helped him from his first days on his own. When he's running away, which was illegal, incidentally, he runs away he's a runaway servant, in a sense, as a bonded apprentice. He broke his apprenticeship bond. When he runs away, he's on the ship to Philadelphia, and just by chance, 2 imperial governors are on that ship with him. William Keith of Pennsylvania and William Burnet of New York, who the latter, William Burnet, was particularly well connected in London. They start to talk to him just as a boy. He's in the cabin with them, and they immediately realize, hey, this guy's going to be somebody. Even though he's only a kid, he's younger than almost everyone in this room, or at same age or younger than almost all of you. They realize he's going to be somebody, and they sort of try to help him early on. They recommended him for his first job with the printer in Philadelphia, and he got that. The printer, took their word seriously, particularly when he's getting it from 2 governors, royal governors, imperial governors, and so he hires him. He also met, while he was there quite by accident in his first days in Philadelphia, a lawyer named Andrew Hamilton. No relationship to Alexander Hamilton. Andrew Hamilton was the leading lawyer in the Mid-Atlantic region at that time. Just by chance, he ran into him in the street and started talking to him. Franklin wrote later in his life that Andrew Hamilton, this famous Philadelphia lawyer, and I quote, interested himself for me strongly, continued his patronage until his death. In acknowledging him at this way, Franklin only played the role of loyal client, which he would play throughout his life. If you helped Franklin, he never forgot it, and thus was able to build up his network of contacts. And that, in a sense, helps explain his success. Philadelphia was not, in some ways, enough for Franklin. And in 1726, with the promise of the backing of several of these great men that he knew, he sailed to London to seek a job in the imperial bureaucracy, in the imperial administration. In other words, to become some kind of official in the empire. The trip, he goes and he tries, and he realizes, one of the things he gets there and he sort of realizes, hey, these guys are powerful in America, but over here in the core of the empire, they're just sort of minor figures. They're well connected, but they don't have the influence to get some unknown like me a job. So he ends up staying there for about 10 months. But even in that instance, Franklin shows something that will, I think, propel him and explains his rise really clearly. He goes there, and rather than just thinking, I got turned down for a job, he immediately gets work with a London printer. And he gets work with the London printer who's using the most modern printing equipment and the most modern printing techniques. And he learns how to use that machinery. He impresses people so much in that moment that when he leaves for London, they give him a loan. Leaves from Philadelphia when he has to leave London, pardon me. They give him a loan to buy modern printing equipment that he can take back to Philadelphia with him. Even though he's sort of an unknown to them, they recognize enough in him to realize, hey, he's going to be successful. So he ends up sailing with some of the most modern print, in fact, the most modern printing equipment in North America. And that allows him, when he returns to Philadelphia, to begin to establish his printing empire, which becomes the center of his business and his wealth. He used his skill, things that he learned in London to establish, as I said, this printing empire. He founded the newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, which becomes the most widespread, successful newspaper in early America, and the almanac Poor Richard's, who most of you, right, have heard Poor Richard's Almanac, or many of you would have heard of this in your high school class. He set up, as he becomes more successful, he set up printers in other colonies. He uses his profits. He plows them back into the business. He sets up printers in other colonies, and he takes as a percentage of their business. In other words, he invests in their business and says, okay, I get half of your profits. I'll supply you with the machinery, the materials you need to run your printing, run your newspaper, run your almanac, but you're going to give me half of the profit of what you make, half of the gross. He became fabulously wealthy doing this. He was also, because he had a head for business, he realized, hey, Philadelphia is growing quickly. He was the first person to realize that in colonial America, the European population was doubling every 20 years. People were pouring into these towns, much as people are pouring into South Carolina and North Carolina today from the north. He realized that this was happening, so he invested in real estate lots in the center of Philadelphia. And he established a real estate empire, which is hardly ever discussed in these sort of general stories about his life, and became fabulously wealthy as a real estate investor, and was extremely successful in sort of understanding how the real estate market was shaped and its kind of boom and bust nature. In fact, he was so successful in business that at age 42, he retired from direct labor. So ungentlemanly, so unrefined. One of the things most of you probably know about Benjamin Franklin, early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. When he got the wealthy part, he said no more, early to bed, early to rise. He became so wealthy that he stopped working directly in his own printing business, hired people to handle that, sort of oversaw some of his real estate investments, but instead decided to devote himself to scientific and political sort of activities. He no longer worked, and in fact told people, I cannot be seen with ink-stained hands if I'm ever going to become a true gentleman. And he completely stops working at age 42. No more physical labor for Franklin. His labor becomes his scientific work and his political work. He realized that just to grasp at things, to get dressed up as a gentleman was vulgar. He wanted to be a real gentleman. And indeed, he became one. He became a Freemason. He joined or founded a number of other clubs and organizations, including the first fire department in Philadelphia, the Library Company of Philadelphia. I don't know if any of you have been there, but it still exists. The American Philosophical Society, where the center I head is housed. And he also helped found the University of Pennsylvania. As a writer, of course, his fame was widespread. He was apparently hilarious. He learned to make humor and to include humor in everything he did. Franklin's scientific experiments, though, are what made him globally famous, or famous in the North Atlantic zone. Actually, globally famous, because news of what he did eventually spreads to the Emperor of China. So you could say globally famous. He had invented bifocals, the Franklin stove, and other things, but the global fame is really connected to the electrical experiments, which began in 1746. He invented the lightning rod, which protected homes from lightning strikes, and he invented the vocabulary we associate with the study of electricity today. He invented the word battery, conductivity. Those are terms that he either invented or furthered to sort of explain what was going on with electricity. He indeed flew a kite in the Philadelphia Passer, which again is probably the thing most of you, raise your hand if you've heard that story, right? The kite story, right? That's real. He did do that in June of 1752. Amazingly, other people had tried that experiment and killed themselves doing that because the charge from so that's why they didn't get famous for it. He realizes I need to be ground to it. Yeah, that's why they didn't get famous. They're dead. He realizes I need to be, grounded in a way that so I won't die. But he does do that. He's assisted in it by his son. He also experimented with what were called Leyden jars, named after the city of Leiden in the Netherlands. These were the kind of first primitive batteries. In other words, they were a type of device that were fairly large, shaped like a jar, that could store an electrical charge. And so he realizes that. He experiments with it. Other people were experimenting with them too. He did not invent that. Obviously, it was invented in the Netherlands. Incidentally, as electricity sort of becomes all the rage in Philadelphia, he likes to try to impress people with his tricks about it. And he would do various things to impress people, make sparks. He actually at one time tried to, or succeeded in electrifying the wrought iron fence around his house And then when people were like outside of his house watching the lightning flash, he sent a sort of sensitive little charge to the fence, and everyone was like, leaping back from it. But the thing that he really did, he once almost killed himself trying to impress visiting ladies by killing a turkey to roast with electricity stored in the Leyden jar. He got so busy showing off for the ladies, he almost electrocuted himself, a shock he described as, and I quote, "a universal blow which spread from head to foot throughout my body." Franklin's scientific experiments, particularly with electricity, had made him, by the mid-1750s, the most famous person in America, by far. He was awarded by both the kings of France and England and made a member of the Royal Society in Britain, which was considered a great honor. The funny thing about that is he had written to them earlier and said, like, I'm doing experiments with electricity. Do you want to know about them? And they're like, provincial, too too colonial. But then when it comes out that he's, succeeded in all these things, then they agreed to it. Incidentally, though, electricity became all the rage in Philadelphia because of his experiments. And right at this time, some merchant captains who were going to South America learned about electric eels. Yeah, they sort of realized, hey, that thing's got an electrical charge in it. That's what's in that thing. So they had one captured and they brought it to Philadelphia. Listen to this. So they're storing it up on the docks. And of course, people got sort of fascinated by this thing because it carried electrical charge. It was a living battery. So it became all the rage to go see this thing. And then finally, a group of young couples, about 8 people, realized, hey, if one of us grab that thing, it's going to, hurt us or even kill us. But if 8 or 10 of us grab it at once, sort of form a circle and hold hands and then grab the eel, the current will go through all of us. And this becomes like a hot date night in colonial Philadelphia. Let's go down to the docks, grab the eel. And people start to do this stuff like, let's go get some eel, Go in, they ran in, the eel will shock them, and all of them go, this became like, ministers preached to get it like, yeah, it's immoral to grab the eel, And so it becomes like all the rage in Philadelphia. Franklin's unconventional career and fame were tied to a personal life that was also unconventional. He had fled his family in Boston, of course, which had been illegal. He liked to enjoy attracting female attention. One of them was a girl named Deborah Reed, a woman of Quaker birth. When he gets to Philadelphia, she's one of the first people he meets too. He immediately takes interest in her. He's 17, she's 15. But of course, in colonial America, they're just teenagers. Of course, in colonial America, that was not uncommon. He courted her, but when he went to London that first time in 1726, he basically blew her off. She married someone else, who she then became alienated from, and he probably died, that husband, but it was unclear whether he was alive or dead. When Franklin returned from London, he began to court her again. By 1730, they had married, but it's actually unclear whether he actually ever formally married. And in fact, no one could ever find a record of him being formally married, although everyone assumed that they were married and they lived as a married couple. More shocking still, after several months of marriage in 1730, when they move in together, he appeared at his home with a new child and told his wife, "This is my son," newborn child, who he named William. His son was raised in the home. He took care of his son. He raised his son in his home, but his wife, Deborah, bitterly, of course, resented this. It is a strange thing. He then had 2 children with Deborah, one of whom, his son, who he called Frankie, was killed by the smallpox when he was 4 years old. And this was, despite, this created a sort of, he had a deep trauma and depression at that juncture because of the death of this young son. Even though the son was only 4 years old, people started saying, hey, he's really going to be something too. You can see how bright he is. But his life, he never tired of attracting female attention. And he never really treated his wife, Deborah, entirely right. He did not speak poorly of her. Was not abusive in any way. But he was not a present husband, I think it's fair to say. When he wasn't involved with science, his time was spent in politics. It is, I think, difficult to overstate just how deeply Franklin was committed to the empire, imperial patronage, and had deep, deep imperial ambitions. In actuality, much of his political time and political energy in the 1750s was devoted to not making Pennsylvania or the colonies more democratic, but getting the Pennsylvania proprietorship away from the Penn family and making Pennsylvania a royal colony with himself as royal governor. And he almost succeeded in that. He attempted to royalize the government of Pennsylvania, and he did not attempt that once. That was an ongoing campaign from the 1750s into the 1760s. He continued to try to do this. His imperial ambitions again became evident when he was sent to London in 1757 to act as the Pennsylvania Assembly's agent in London. The governments in colonial America sent representatives to London to represent them to Parliament and the imperial administration. Franklin is sent from Pennsylvania by the Pennsylvania Assembly because he was so important and so prominent. It was a trip that ended up lasting almost 20 years. His mature life was in London and in Paris, not in Philadelphia. He loved London. It was the biggest city in the world, of the most important, the capital of the most important empire in the Atlantic zone. And he was famous and he liked living there. He only returns briefly to America in the mid-1760s for a few months. The rest of his adult life is spent in Europe. And then he returns at the time of the Declaration of Independence. He basically was living as a European in a sense, or a British, in Britain. He brought his son that had been born out of wedlock, William, with him with the clear intention of getting him a job in the empire. And amazingly, because those jobs were particularly hard to come by for Americans, he gets his son, William, appointed Royal Governor of New Jersey. And that son, William, was the last Royal Governor of New Jersey and stayed in office until independence. He was an incredibly able man as well. It's pretty clear as he gets that, and he's trying desperately to get the government of Pennsylvania royalized, he's also going to imperial officials. Sometimes on the same day, in the morning, he would go to some imperial officials and say, look, proprietary colonies, which is what Pennsylvania was. In other words, it was gifted to a family, Pennsylvania, the Penn family. He says to them, look, these colonies don't work. You need to royalize that colony, make a royal governor, take it under direct royal control, which some colonies were governed that way and others were governed in other ways. He would have this long discussion with them, quite polite, make a quite forceful argument. In the afternoon, he would go see another royal official in another part of this giant, sprawling imperial bureaucracy and would say to them, give my son William and I a proprietary colony in the Ohio country. We want 20 million acres, and we'll start the sort of imperialization of the British interior, of the interior of North America, in the area what's beyond Pittsburgh, what's now Pittsburgh. In other words, he's arguing for two diametrically opposed things on the same day. He did this repeatedly. And it says something about Franklin. Some people would call that duplicitous, and in a way it is, but he was a person of tremendous ambition and tremendous energy. He wanted his own British colony. Even the outbreak of the imperial crisis did nothing to dampen his desire for imperial preferment. When the London authorities, with no sense of malice towards the colonies, passed the Stamp Act, which I talked about in the opening statement, they provoked a storm of protest. Franklin, though, initially accepted the Stamp Act and had been effectively out of America so long at that point. He'd been out of America 9 years, basically 8 years by the time, 8 years by the time that this was passed, that he had no idea how bitter the opposition to it had become. He actually says to royal officials, I think this is a bad idea, but if you're going to do it, do it. Amazingly, the Stamp Act collector for Pennsylvania was his friend. He got the guy the job, John Hughes. It's his man. Charles Thompson, the Recorder Secretary for Congress, recalled in an account early in the 19th century. This is a quote, that at the time of the Stamp Act, John Hughes, a particular friend of Dr. Franklin's, was made stamp master, and that it was by Franklin's recommendation to the royal authorities. Because, Thompson replied, Dr. Franklin had no idea that the colonies would resist, and the stamp master might as well be a friend as an enemy. He got the guy appointed to the Stamp Act collector. This is this thing which he then later on almost immediately speaks against. Hughes' home was ransacked, incidentally, by the Philadelphia mob in retaliation for him becoming stamp master. He's attacked by a crowd. In a little-known corollary to that attack, that same crowd surrounded Franklin's house and threatened to destroy it. And it was his wife, who hadn't seen him in 8 years, and her family who defended it, told him no. And she actually comes out and says, no, you've got this all wrong. He's opposed to the Stamp Act, And they sort of accept that and they go away. But the truth was, he had gotten this guy the job as Stamp Act collector. Franklin, in fact, tried to turn the entire imperial crisis to his advantage. As cynical as all this may sound and all this, Franklin is in many ways to be admired. He was a person who accepted that there was a change happening. He did not label it at all, label all things good or bad. He looked at the change and said, basically, what is entailed here? He didn't suffer reversals. He saw everything as an opportunity to go forward. And in certain ways, he even sees the imperial crisis this way, as something that might, in the end, be turned not only to his own personal advantage, which was part of it, but might be used in a way that advantaged many people. But he was a person of tremendous resilience. And a lot of the stuff, which I say, it sounds cynical in a way, that he was cynical and sort of manipulative, perhaps, but he was also a person of tremendous resilience and vision and ability. While he understood the depths of emotion in America, he did not believe a revolution was possible, and he continued to try to get that 20 million acres in the Ohio country as his own British colony until 1773, and made a very concerted push for that in 1773. He also sought to manipulate the imperial government into appointing him into a role of what we would call viceroy or governor general of America in a kind of reorganized empire. And of course, he was right. He was thinking, I don't think these imperial authorities are necessarily up to handling America in this situation. They should appoint me because I could do it better, which, quite frankly, he was right. He could do it better. He might indeed have become a loyalist, and in fact, his son William becomes the leader of the loyalist movement in the American Revolution. Amazing as that sounds. He had come into possession of private correspondence in 1773, the private correspondence of Thomas Hutchinson, the last civilian governor of Massachusetts, and an acquaintance of Franklin from at least 1754. Franklin, in an unbelievable breach of gentlemanly etiquette, had those letters, Hutchinson's correspondence, published. He did this, Parliament, of course, took great offense at this, and this leads to his unraveling of his position in the empire. But he didn't do it for that reason. He didn't do it to sort of try to embarrass Hutchinson, at least not in a malicious, it was malicious, but not in a kind of personal way. But he did it to try to give Parliament a scapegoat, to try to diffuse the imperial crisis, which by then in 1773, it was starting to boil and would erupt really into a revolutionary crisis in 1774. He published the letters as a way of giving the imperial leadership a scapegoat to allow them to blame the imperial crisis on Hutchinson, which a lot of people in America thought was true anyway, even though it was not. Listen to this. He writes at this time to the Reverend Cooper. He gets in terrible trouble with the authorities over this and ultimately is forced to leave England. Writing to the Reverend Cooper, a Boston minister, he declared, "You can have no conception of the rage the ministerial people have with me on the act of transmitting those letters. It is quite incomprehensible." Listen to this. "If they had been wise, they might have made good use of the discovery," in other words, their publication, "by agreeing to lay the blame for all our differences on those from whom by these letters it appeared to have arisen," and meaning Governor Hutchinson of Massachusetts, "and by a change of measures would have appeared natural and then restored harmony." In other words, he was saying to them, he was smarter than they were. He was saying, this is going to turn into a general crisis. Here's a way out. Throw this guy under the bus, even if he doesn't deserve it. Blame him. Get him, he was already on his way out in Massachusetts anyway. Blame him for it all, and then use this as a moment to say, hey, we didn't know all this was going on. Let's make an accommodation here. That would have avoided the breach in the empire and would have avoided the war. But in the fallout that followed, Franklin was repeatedly denounced. He was summoned before the Privy Council and sort of attacked without mercy and threatened with arrest. Nonetheless, he waited, I think, almost 10 months before he left Britain. He refashioned himself while on the ship home. He starts to tell everyone on the ship, I published those letters to expose the big conspiracy against America. But he claimed to have, done this out of the most patriotic motives. When he gets to Philadelphia, the other people who we call the founding fathers, who had gathered, at this point, they were gathering to form the Continental Congress. They were already on their way. The fighting in Lexington Concord had already broken out. When he gets there, they're extremely skeptical. They know a lot about what he was doing, and they're like, hey, does anybody really buy this whole, I was doing this for the common good? But the one thing, and I believe it may have been John Adams, one of the others, somebody says at some point, we cannot do without this guy. He is the most famous American. None of us have any reach beyond him. We need him. We need him on board. Arriving in May 1775, he claimed, as I said, to be a principled defender of American liberties. Arriving in May 1775, he almost immediately became involved in the politics of that moment that led to American independence. And I think we can stop here and imagine him sort of stepping off that ship in Philadelphia. And we can now, as he comes down the plank and walks onto the docks, it's a good moment to stop and consider his career as a constitutional writer. Because when he comes off that boat, that's the sort of moment where it really turns in another direction. Unlike the other founding fathers, Franklin had experience creating constitutional structures. He had experience creating what we would call fundamental law. And in fact, when he walked off that ship in 1775, he was in the middle of his career as a Constitution writer. Franklin had been framing what we would think of as constitutional structures at least since 1754, when he was one of the primary authors, not the sole author, but the primary driving force of something called the Albany Plan. Who's heard of this? The Albany Plan with the snake, right? You know, have you ever seen the picture of the snake fragmented? It was a plan to restructure the British Empire right on the eve of what was called the French and Indian or 7 Years' War, which breaks out in 1755, sort of slowly eroding conflict. It called for an entire reorganization of the empire's institutional structure, particularly in America. The British Constitution, as many of you may know, was an unwritten constitution. It's not like our document that we have where you have a document, you can read the text. The British Constitution is based on precedent. The Albany Plan was a plan to restructure the empire and basically create a kind of general, what they call the General Council in America, a kind of assembly body ruled over by a Viceroy General or what they call President General or Governor General, had different names, but an appointed imperial official who would basically be the governor of America on a certain level. Franklin had himself in mind for that job. The truth is, he was probably the most qualified person who probably would have done the best job in a sense. But this plan, which is sometimes treated by historians as somehow calling for American independence or proto-democratic, in fact, was entirely designed to save the British Empire, to make defense of that empire in North America easier. They were almost at war with France, which had a colony in Canada at that time, and was in fact designed to center control in the head of that viceroy, that imperial kind of super governor. He was going to get control and control the entire structure of it. The General Council had some say in it, this sort of assembly body, but it was limited. It was not democratic. It was not American. It was entirely imperial in its nature. It would basically added a new layer of imperial government into America with Franklin as viceroy. You can look at this plan online. I encourage you to do so. Actually, there's multiple drafts of it. You can go take a look at it. There were over 200 plans like this floated in the empire to reform its structure. I'm writing a book on this with a co-author, so I am very interested in it. But all kinds of people become involved in this. He tried at least once after the Albany Plan, and maybe twice. In 1766, he suggested a plan to reorganize the finances of the empire in a manner that would have drawn the colonial assemblies into the British orbit of the British Treasury and the Bank of England, made them sort of appendages of the Bank of England in a weird way, sort of lending offices. He did this to try to create a way that the empire could draw a taxation currency from the colonies without causing problems. He was also may have been involved in plans that were floated in 1774 to restructure the empire, but he was almost certainly an influence on this writer. His name was Joseph Galloway. He also became a leading loyalist. The Galloway plans, as they're known, are based on the Albany Plan of 1754. There's a connection there. He was one of Franklin's closest friends before the War of the American Revolution, and it's entirely possible he was involved. Such plans, incidentally, represent a separate constitutional discourse in the Anglo-American world that's almost been entirely ignored by scholars. There's hardly any, they're each treated as sort of separate episodes. In fact, it was an ongoing discourse about imperial reform, reforming the structure of the British Empire, and it was in fact forgotten. But this discourse plays into the American Revolution. People continue to float these plans. Both British people and Americans fighting for the American cause float plans like this throughout the entire period up until 1783. But I do think in that moment when he steps off that boat, by that moment, Franklin realized that the empire in America was on the verge of collapse. And he accepted that his future in the British Empire was over. And so his constitutional thinking shifted. He looked to British precedents, but in a very different way. He becomes the author of the first government of America, which failed. It was not adopted. He's the author of the first plan of the Articles of Confederation, the government that rules America effectively from 1776 to 1787. He is the first author of a plan on that. His plan is rejected, but the plan in its sort of basic structure, it had a plural executive instead of a single like president or governor. It had like a council, and then it had a single house legislature below it, no Senate. It looked flat, in other words. No Senate, just no upper house, just one assembly body. There's a copy of it in the Madison papers. It's attributed to Franklin. It was, the editors of the Madison papers say this is Franklin's plan. It was attributed to him. The plan that they looked at when they published it was in Franklin's handwriting. It basically was a kind of assembly body. It also acted as an executive in relationship to the states. It's kind of a weird government. It was not adopted. It was ultimately sort of rejected, and later on, a different author, John Dickinson, who some of you may have heard of. He's a famous author of the Revolutionary period. Created that basic articles government that basically ruled the colonies from 1776 to 1787. But what's strange is that this government that he created, Franklin, was almost certainly modeled on the first government in England that came into being after the execution of King Charles I in the English Civil Wars, called the Instrument of State. It had a plural executive and a single house government. Without a doubt, this is the model that Franklin was working on, because the premise was the imperial contract has dissolved and has gone flat, and we now, are in a state of nature. And in the state of nature, the social distinctions that call for an upper house and a lower house in an assembly don't exist. A year later, in the summer and fall of 1776, after working on the Declaration of Independence with Jefferson, although Jefferson's obviously the primary author, Franklin was elected as the head of the president, elected as president of the Pennsylvania State Constitutional Convention, called to write a state constitution for Pennsylvania. At that moment, the state conventions were the primary constitutional laboratory for experiments in Republican self-government in the American Revolution. In the American Revolution, constitutional action is primarily in the states, and the federal convention is kind of an anomaly. It's really the states which is the scene of politics in many ways in terms of experimentation. This Pennsylvania Constitution that this body that he was president of was considered the most radical constitution in the American Revolution by far. There's been a strong tendency that began in 1776 and continues until today to ascribe the authorship of that document to a loose group of unknown plebeian radicals. This was something that they claimed at the time, and then later on claimed as part of, scholars in the 20th century of the left claimed the same thing. A recent study summed up this line of thought by claiming that this most radically democratic frame of government that the world had ever seen was created by a relatively unknown group of radicals. Others who've discussed this have thrown in Thomas Paine as a likely leader, this despite the fact that Thomas Paine did not attend the convention. The ambiguity over this document's authorship began in 1776 and has never been resolved. It is not considered resolvable by scholars. I find this reasoning absolutely bizarre. The available evidence points directly at Franklin as the author. The structure of this government, plural executive with a single house government underneath it. The exact same model of the thing they had written the year before. He was the president of the convention that writes this thing. It had no Senate, same thing. It had no independent judiciary, which Franklin did not believe in. It had a Bill of Rights attached to it. The Bill of Rights for the thing is in Franklin's handwriting, and people still reject the fact that he's the author of the thing. It's strange. It began, the efforts to obscure this authorship, it goes deep into the sort of constitutional consciousness of the period. Many of the other founding fathers feared unicameralism, government without a Senate, or they were hostile to it. And their leader in their hostility was John Adams. He's the intellectual leader of bicameral constitutionalism. In other words, governments like the government we have now, on the federal and state level. In other words, with a governor, an upper house, a lower house, and an independent judiciary. Franklin was a rejecter of those things and remained a rejecter of them throughout his entire life. Quickly, one state has a unicameral government. Anyone know it? Nebraska, correct. Nebraska, radical Nebraska, I'm telling you. Nebraska is different. It has a single house government that's in part based on this Pennsylvania government. These states, a lot of lawyers, a lot of the political leadership, particularly in the Continental Army's leadership, rejected unicameralism. This has obscured the fact that, in my opinion, this type of government without an upper house, often a government without governments without a governor or president, without a leader executive, single executive, in 1776, that was the most popular form of constitutionalism in the American Revolution. 3 of the states adopt that type of government, but there's powerful movements for it in other states, and they're barely held off in a kind of long-running set of disagreements. Franklin, of course, is very cagey about what he did initially at that time. But as many of you know, in 1776, at the end of the year, he's dispatched to France to act as America's diplomat to France, trying to get an alliance with France so they can survive the war. He, of course, knew the French. It is a command performance, incidentally. Franklin is by far the greatest American diplomat. Forget Henry Kissinger, George Marshall. They're amateurs compared to Franklin. Franklin had gone to visit the King of France in 1767, dressed up like a fine English gentleman, all silk, white powdered wig, silver walking stick, very charming, very sort of urbane. Now he arrives in early 1777, dressed in homemade, homespun, and wearing a raccoon on his head, pretending to be like this philosopher from the woods. Everyone in France, they'd all met him before, but they're like, yeah, I'm going to go with this. So they all go with it. He becomes the he becomes the star of France. He's the only, I like to joke, I've been in France a lot lately, and when I talk about Franklin, I always say he's the only American Frenchman came to really love. It's true. From then to now, there's only been one American they love, Franklin. He lives, he says, yes, I'm a simple Quaker philosopher. He's not even a Quaker. He became a huge celebrity. He gets France to come in the war. He knows France is bankrupting itself, fighting the war, but he doesn't care. He gets them to keep giving the money. In fact, at one point, they give him a huge loan, and he says to someone in private, they keep doing things like this, they're going to go bankrupt. In other words, even though he's encouraging to do it. Throughout his time in France, though, he distributed models of that Pennsylvania Constitution and other state governments. And when he distributed the Pennsylvania Constitution, he called it "My Government," which is a clear ownership of of authoring it. Franklin finally returned from France in 1785. He had basically been out of America since 1757, with only 2 short visits to America, but none of which lasted. One lasted a year and a half, one lasted 6 months. Entire time living either in London or Paris. He finally, and then in that moment of his life, he entered his last stage of his life as a constitutionalist, as his participation in the Federal Convention. Although he eventually supported the Federal Convention's concluding document with its strong executive bicameral government, very different from the government he had created in 1776, his personal views about constitutionalism had not changed. In fact, during the Constitutional Convention, he advocated for a unicameral government for America with a plural executive. And the issue of plural executive was debated at length in the convention. And in fact, the unicameral thing was debated at length in the convention in a certain way. In the face of an audience largely committed to having a single strong executive, he wrote at a certain point, a single executive he believed may be good, but the successor often differs in opinion of those measures and adopts others, and often is ambitious of distinguishing himself by opposing them and offering new projects. He did support the Constitution that emerged in 1787 because he was worried about the turmoil in the society and believed in this kind of strong central location of sovereignty, but that does not mean he abandoned unicameralism. In fact, in April 1788, he wrote to one of his French contacts declaring, I am of the opinion that that the 2 chambers were not necessary. 1 chamber is entirely sufficient. And in fact, he called for revision of the Constitution along those lines, but it failed. And in fact, Franklin's last writings, public writings, done very early in 1789, were in defense of the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776, which he was clearly the author of because it was under attack and ultimately would be scrapped in 1790. It was his last statement and was issued alongside with his more famous writing at that moment against slavery. In this document, he vehemently defended unicameralism and questioned the motives of those who supported it. By that time, in that moment in 1789, Franklin knew he was near the end of his life, and it was a life, of course, of astonishing achievements. He had become by then one of the most famous people in the Atlantic world and lionized by almost everyone as a founder, one of the key founders of the American nation. And yet, as astonishing as it may seem now, after all these achievements during the Revolution, he really was the greatest American diplomat who has ever lived because of his success in France. It was remarkable. I mean, he's the one who talks the French into the war. He talks them into sending the expeditionary forces into the Western Hemisphere. He plays a central role. This particular founding father, in that moment at the end of his life, he wished at the end of that life that the revolution that he had made and that had made him essentially immortal, he wished it had never occurred. And he remained, at his heart, I think, a British subject, a British colonial. Perhaps the reason for that was the alienation from his son. His son William becomes the leader of the Loyalist movement in North America, and in fact, they never fully reconciled. But I would say this. He saw the path not taken to that very different future for himself and America. In other words, where he would not have been alienated from his son, and he expressed it in discussing his own efforts at revising the British Constitution in America. On reflection, he wrote, "It now seems probable that if the foregoing plan, meaning the Albany Plan of Union, that plan of 1754, or something like it had been adopted and carried into execution, the subsequent separation of the colonies from the mother country might not so soon have happened." And that he thought was a good thing. Indeed, he believed, and I quote again, "the mischiefs suffered on both sides might have been put off until a later century, and that too was a good thing. The united colonies," he went on to say, would have been sufficient to their own defense, and thus an army from Britain for that purpose would have been unnecessary. The Stamp Act and the subsequent revenue acts that, of course, drive the imperial crisis and split the American colonies away from Britain, and I quote again, "would not have existed, nor the other projects for drawing a revenue from America to Britain by the acts of Parliament, which were the cause of such terrible expense of blood and treasure." Franklin knew, as he said, it failed. The Crown, meaning the royal government, disapproved the Albany Plan, and as did the colonial assemblies. He realizes and he expresses this anguish that he feels about this tremendous change. As famous as it made him, as well known as he became, as celebrated as he became, he realized that for himself, his life had been in the empire. And I think, as I said, part of it is his alienation from his child, from his son, but part of it was he realized that the convulsions they had gone through would take decades to work themselves out, which indeed they do. In closing, though, let me say that the relevance of 1776 and the founders, including Franklin and the revolution itself, has been forgotten in many parts of our society today. A significant portion of students arrive at college, at least in the hedonistic North where I teach, with only a vague sense of the American Revolution, early America, or indeed anything that happened before 1929. For those students who do not know about the year of independence, the struggles, the war, the founding fathers, indifference or even contempt is not an uncommon view. This is especially true of their views of the revolutionary leadership, who seem to be completely out of sync with the values and needs of our own time, especially as understood in the American Academy. These leaders appear to many people to seem to have been strange men in strange garb, wearing weird wigs, who insisted on holding on to disturbing beliefs about society and government, even as the revolution engulfed them. They make for good musicals, but are anachronistic guides to our own troubled and often divided times. To that I say I beg to differ. I think perhaps we have collectively been too eager to deny the relevance of 1776 to us today, too sure of our own superiority to listen to the revolutionary leaders' advice about society, human nature, and government, and too quick to disparage or simply ignore the national past that began in those desperate and idealistic days 250 years ago. I've described the Benjamin Franklin that's all human here, and many of you may find that description cynical. But Benjamin Franklin and the others were wrestling with fundamental questions about humanity, political and social contract, fundamental law, and with their own imperfections and ambitions and fears and shortcomings. And Franklin understood his own, and he understood himself as a human being and not as a god. While they may not be perfect, the powerful lessons of their actions, their lives, and their revolutionary commitment, and their commitment to a revolutionary world, it bears serious examination, and carrying that examination forward today and its worthwhile lessons is invaluable to all of us. And I think Franklin is as much a marker of that as any of the founding fathers. Thank you for having me.
So we had a speaker a few weeks ago whom nobody in the audience could hear. Did anyone have a problem today hearing Professor McConville? No, I don't think so. All right, we have some time for questions, so we'll take our first questions from students. Will. Yeah, you're good.
First off, I'm Will Lawson, senior Lyceum program. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. First of all, I just appreciate the fantastic rendition of his life as a whole in Franklin. Something that I now know too little about, and I'm looking forward to learn more. But this is an overall question: Is Franklin a role model? I think that you presented a very interesting tension in this, cynical interpretation that you admit, but then also are redeeming at the same time, of this ambition and drive that allows someone to be an opportunist, but also maybe actions not reflecting principles that one holds, that then leads to dissatisfaction and anguish in the end.
Right. No, look, it's a fabulous question, because if we look at these people, we're not only forced to engage with them as historical figures, but to come to terms with their morality and their moral failings, which they all had, quite frankly. If you want perfection in saints, you know where you should go? A graveyard, because that's the only place there are people who are perfect. We're all flawed. Franklin was flawed. He's a role model in several regards, I think. Number one, he was a person who lived out to the full the abilities he'd been given. He took them as far as he could take them, in science, in politics, in writing. He used what his God-given gifts, if you want to put it that way, to the best of his ability. Number two, he was resilient. That cynical part is really about resilience. When something goes wrong for Franklin, he doesn't just roll up in a ball and start crying. He starts thinking, how can I come out of this the better? We can find that cynical or, however, but in many ways it's to be admired, because he's able to sort of turn any kind of event. He doesn't look at any event as a reversal, but rather as an opportunity, and he's to be admired for that. Finally, I would say this, is that although in terms of his operating in the empire, he was complete, he was tricky. But the truth is, in the end, he devoted himself to the cause of national independence, even though, as you heard in that last quote, he himself had tremendous doubt about what was happening. And he never wavered from that cause once he committed himself to it. Incidentally, he also committed himself to emancipation. Franklin was a slaveholder, which isn't well known. He had 3 or 4 household slaves. As the revolution breaks out and unfolds, he emancipates them and becomes, in my opinion, an extremely sincere convert to the end of slavery and, to emancipation. He's an admirable person. He's a human. He says at one point when they're debating over the issue of slavery in the Continental Congress at the time of independence, and he does not, Adams does not want to concede on the issue of the language, the anti-slavery language in the Declaration. And Franklin, which is portrayed in the musical 1776, if any of you have ever seen it, it's portrayed, a version of it portrayed, but it's true. He turns to Adams and says, you want people to think we were gods in the future, and we're just human. And in that, he's also to be admired for understanding. Now you can say, well, that concedes, and it does. It concedes something that, allowed for the continuation of, this abomination. But at the same time, there's a 34,000-man British strike force entering New York Harbor, and they've got to get a unanimous decision. So there's no sort of, you know what I mean? He's willing to say, yes, I know this is wrong, but we better do something. That's a harsh sentence, because you're passing sentence on people who are enslaved. You're saying, yes, I'm not going to fight for that. But what you are saying is, he actually says, none of it will mean anything if we're all hung, if we're all destroyed. So he's a tremendously, a figure to be tremendously admired, but he was all too human and had many all too human traits, as we all do.
More questions, please.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. I'm Ashley Burgess, a junior Lyceum scholar, and I'm really interested in this Albany system of government. Do you think that having a plural executive would have prevented some of the factionalism that we're seeing here in modern American history?
One of the things they argued at the time of the Federal Convention of 1787, which Franklin was party to, they argued for a plural executive based on region. In other words, at that time, one from the South, one from the Mid-Atlantic, one from New England. And Franklin supported that. But in the end, a lot of the others who I think were wiser said, look, all that's going to lead to is fighting in the executive, where it will become paralyzed as well as the thing. So you get a kind of difference. But he experimented with the form of government in a way that the others did not. The experiments he advocated for, both in the imperial level, all failed. So there's something to that. You have to. There is a kind of resistance to it. But nonetheless, I do think that he argued for that because at the time of the revolution, when the revolution comes in, he puts that into the Articles of Confederation government and then into the Pennsylvania government. The fear was of executive power. And that was a common fear throughout the original constitutions, even in the governments that had governors, the powers of the governors were greatly diminished compared to the imperial governors because people feared strong executive power. They wanted, it was a diffused revolution in favor of liberty. And therefore the government they wanted tighter control, and they wanted that sort of, they did not want those executives able to clamp down and deny the will of the people, as they would put it. Yeah.
So it seemed from the way you framed it that all of Franklin's trips to Europe were personally advantageous. But what about with his role in American politics? Was the amount of time that he spent in Europe helpful to the colonies and helpful to American independence and his role in that? Or did it kind of, the separation it created become sort of a disadvantage?
We wouldn't be here if he hadn't gone to Europe. Or we'd be speaking French and eating better. One or the other. Eating better and dressing better. Yeah, right. We'd be dressing better and eating better. We wouldn't be here. It's his role in drawing the French into the war. Because what happens when that war begins in 1778 is that the war becomes a global war. They're fighting in India, which is known as the Fourth Mysore War. They're fighting in Indonesia. Great Britain attacks the Netherlands in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War and destroys the Dutch fleet because they're afraid the Dutch are going to join with the French to invade England. It becomes a world war, and that means that the British can't concentrate their forces here. So that is to the advantage of the colonies. He also secures loan. The American cause almost collapses in 1780. It almost collapses twice during the Revolution. In the fall of 1776, when Washington's army is almost destroyed in New York and New Jersey, and in 1780 because of hyperinflation. The little bit of inflation we're having now, as you know, has created great political emotion. No, it has. They were having hyperinflation, 100% price rises. The states were out of control printing money. Goods were scarce. There was all kinds of turmoil. The French stabilized the economy by pumping gold into the economy. And that's when Franklin says, hey, if they keep doing things like this, they're going to go bankrupt, which is exactly what happens to them. But he, of course, is interested in the American cause. Once he commits himself to the American cause in 1775, he does not, in terms of his public life, waver from that commitment. He goes, incidentally, when he returns from France, there's $100,000 worth of gold missing from his embassy in France. He didn't use this personally, but I'm pretty sure he probably used it to get influence with French officials and stuff, which is how business was done. When somebody asks him about it, he says basically, yeah, well, you wouldn't have a country if we didn't have done that. But he does not waver from his commitment to America once he enters American independence. Up until then, he maintained that he was a very cagey and cunning imperial operator.
All right, we'll take one last question.
This has been such a great topic. I think that Benjamin Franklin's just such a cool, eccentric guy, and I love learning more about him. In my American Political Thought class, we've been able to read a couple excerpts from his autobiography that he wrote when he was a young man. And what was very interesting about it was kind of his relationship with virtue and trying to become a more virtuous person and resolving to try and become a perfectly virtuous person. And he took like a very scientific approach towards that. So I wanted to ask you about more of his relationship with religion and how that informed his policy and scientific things.
It's absolutely fabulous question. As I said early on, people called him a deist. That was not true, but he was he had unorthodox religious beliefs. He had questions about the divinity of Christ and about the Trinity. This went on for many years. As I said, he also became a vegetarian at that time. This went on for many years. He eventually is asked at a certain point later on in life, in the 1760s, I think he's first asked this question, and then in the 1770s, and he says, I'm unsure about the divinity of Christ, but I think Christianity, the most important religion in the world, and I'm willing to concede the divinity of Christ to others. When he's at the end of his life, he's, in my mind, a Christian, although with some kind of unorthodox beliefs attached to that. He says at one point, right before he's going to die, in that quote in that same letter, with that quote that I read at the end of the lecture, he says to someone, I'm about to find out the truth of the afterlife. He really was a questioning person at that point. how it's connected to his scientific achievement is this. This unorthodox religious belief was strongly connected to scientific rationalism, as we understand it. That did not mean that those people were not believers. And one of the things about the founding fathers in religion is this. For example, Hamilton was treated in many accountings as basically, again, very unorthodox, heretical. But at the end of his life, by the time he's at the end of his life, Hamilton, we would consider him an evangelical Christian. This was accelerated by the death of his son in a duel shortly before his own death in a duel. And this is also true. John Jay was a millennialist. He believed that the end of the world was coming, and that the American Revolution and the French Revolutions were signs of that. And so their religious beliefs changed over time, but they were connected in that unorthodox to the advance of a certain form of scientific rationalism. That is sometimes labeled the Enlightenment, but I think it's kind of a more, which is, in a broad kind of general sense is true, but is related to a much more complex issue about this. There's an excellent book about this, an old book, it's about 60 years old, by a fellow named Conrad Wright Sr., who taught at Harvard Divinity School. And he explores the contradictions in their belief. Joseph Priestley, who you might know is one of the great rationalist scientists, but he also believed in miracles and believed in an afterlife. So they're not easy to define, and their beliefs change over time in their lives.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, join me, please, in thanking Professor McConville.
Thank you for having me.